I got this note from a friend of mine in high school. Actually, he was my co-valedictorian. And he's asking for information about the urban heat island effect, or what he's giving me information on it. And he says that climatologists have summarily discounted the urban heat island effect, which, if true, could be an important point to make. He says climatologists face the problem of why temperatures only seem to be going up at urban weather stations. Therefore, they assume that 20% of the thermometers must be right and the 80% in rural areas must be wrong. So they rather arbitrarily adjust all of the data from the rural thermometers to match trends from the urban ones. Now, you might think this sounds dubious, but I've seen the same thing go on in the field of cosmology, where they see stars and galaxies which their measurements indicate that they're 40 billion light years away, and then they continue to insist that that fits in with Hubble's law, where the universe is 13.7 billion years old. And since those facts don't fit together, it means that somehow they're adjusting all of the data to match the trends. And they're not even doing that for any political reasons I know of. They're just doing it because they are convinced that the universe is not flying, that the galaxies aren't flying away from each other, so they have to make all of these strange adjustments to fix it. So the idea that maybe they're fudging the data a little bit to make it match their theory better does scare me a bit. Unfortunately, I'm not able to probably go in there and address the issue myself, because if they're being kind of dishonest about this, the chances are they're not really showing the original data. They're somewhere hidden in the footnotes somewhere. They've got they might have some kind of cryptic thing to note how they made the adjustment, or something like that. But how would you go about finding something if somebody is deceiving themselves on the thing? They won't have any sense that what they're doing is incorrect, because they have already convinced themselves. And if they are deceiving themselves, then it's very unlikely that you will find a reference to that self-deception in the documentation. And you'll find that they will just, and other scientists will see that and just take that as, well, as gospel. And then if that sort of thing happens, then the only choice that, rational people have to do is say, this doesn't sound right. And but so that's kind of why I'm starting this series, is because I don't want to come back and say, no, they're not lying. What are you, an idiot? So I don't want to say, just come back and return tit for tat. Say, you accused us of fudging the data. Well, I accuse you of being a jerk and not listening to the scientific method or whatever. Because while I do put a lot of faith in the scientific method, I don't put that much faith in the human ability to follow the scientific method. So problem is, we all have a tendency to look for confirmation of our ideas. The scientific method is supposed to start with an observation, which leads to a description and an explanation, and then that description and explanation leads to a prediction, and then that prediction leads to an observation. And if that observation happens, then we say that's kind of a confirmation of our theory. But most of the time, our explanation and description can get mixed up. So we put our explanation before our description, and we have a tendency to describe the thing in a way that best fits with our prediction, with our theory. So that's called confirmation bias, when our description of what is going on is kind of misses some details that really don't fit in with our theory. Now, there's really not that much that's done in, as far as well, I can only speak for myself. When I was in college, I don't think that a whole lot was done to avoid this kind of confirmation bias in the scientific experimentation. There was a tendency for teachers to grade, rather than grading at a understanding of the theory, they graded the laboratories on the data itself. So if your data showed a good fit with the theory within, say, 5% of the predicted values, then you got a good score on your laboratory report. Whereas if your data was wildly off from the mark, then you would get a bad grade on your data report, on your laboratory report. Now, I'm not sure if that's really the way I saw when I was at U of I. Probably not so much, but I do see that high school students that come into my physics class, a lot of times they think that if their data is way far away from the values predicted by the theory, then they'll get a bad grade. But my main point when I do a laboratory report, I try to make sure that just the data that they got implies the conclusion, or the data plus the formula leads to the conclusion that they got. And if that conclusion is saying this experiment does not support the theory, then I'd like at least some possible explanation. I need some possible explanation, some possible sources of error. And this is something I find I don't have enough time or energy to teach the students to look for the sources of error. Sometimes I can figure out what went wrong in their experiment just based on what data they took. A lot of times there's some systematic error. Like, for instance, maybe we were assuming that some ramp was on a level plane, but actually one end was just a tiny bit higher than the other. So it skews all of the data about the velocities and positions of the objects because there's a slight acceleration in that direction. So what my friend was suggesting here, as these scientists have identified this urban effect as rather than as a real phenomenon, they have decided that it is some kind of systematic error, and they instead of using the data that they get, they adjust all of the data from the rural thermometers to match the trends from the urban ones. So let me Google that for you. I typed in climatologists adjust thermometer in urban areas. See, this one looks interesting. Everyone freaks out about 2 new climate change studies. Climate change and urbanization, urban climatology. So which one sounds like it might involve what Derek just said? How about everyone freaks out about 2 new climate change studies? Okay, this says 2 new, not yet peer-reviewed studies were published online. Suggest different answers. Argues that the second argues that half of the recent warming in the U.S. is artificial. The first paper comes from the Berkeley Earth Surface Temperature Project, run by Richard Muller. It says the average world land temperature globe is, well, the increase, I would think, is approximately 1.5 degrees Celsius in the past 250 years, and about 0.9 degrees in the past 50 years. In that paper best claimed to have taken into account issues raised by skeptics, such as possible biases from urban heating, data selection, poor station quality, and data adjustment. And they've demonstrated that these do not unduly bias the results. And it looks like the counter-argument to that is that the idea that their data selection and data adjustment does unduly bias the result. Yeah, I would say if they are actually doing data adjustment, as you claim, yes, that is there's no excuse for doing that. You record the data that you got without any adjustment, and then you explain the error that you got, in my opinion. It's a very simple question. If their original data is published, then they're being honest, and if their original data is not published, then they're being dishonest. It doesn't necessarily mean they are lying to me so much as lying to themselves. We don't care about their opinions of the bias. What we want to do is to judge, be fairly shown the evidence, and then draw our own conclusions. If they're drawing those conclusions for us and then only publishing the conclusions without the original data, then they have no excuse when climate skeptics come after them. On the other hand, this other paper, Anthony Watts and his colleagues published their new study. Wait, is this a peer-reviewed study or a not yet peer-reviewed study? Is this a publication on the internet, or I don't know. In any case, the press release for the new Watts study suggests, okay, why don't you tell us what the study itself said rather than what the press release said for it. Suggests that the weather station quality would be a significant issue that undermines higher global average temperature trends implied by the data reported. That weather station quality would be a significant issue. That's definitely true. If the weather station, and it's right to, if they should question the weather station quality in any good report, because well, you want to make sure that you're reporting the correct data, and if your eyes and ears are not working properly, then you need to like point out the possibilities of significant issues. Well, the main thing is scientists have doubts about stuff, and a good scientist will point out their doubts about stuff. And according to this article, the good news is that both Watts and Best have been completely transparent about their calculations and their data. This should make it possible for each to check each other's work and get back to the rest of us with their results. They both are aiming to have their work published in peer-reviewed journals as well. In the meantime, I fully expect that the public conversation over climatology will continue to remain just as civil as it has always been. So this is something very important to me, transparency, to make sure that people are being transparent about their work. As far as I can tell, there haven't been any real arguments of people fudging their data or anything like this at this time. So the only thing I really don't like about this, let's see if I can actually find these papers. Possibly not, since they are on the internet, did they say? Yeah, they were published online, but they haven't been peer-reviewed. Oh, duh. There's links right there. Let's see what I find here. Summary of results. Annual surface temperature. Decadal land surface temperature. Human effect. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, it does look like it's out there. This is probably not the whole paper, but summary of results. Let's see, I want to see if it's possible to see the whole paper, maybe. Well, here's a 2-page summary. So that was got by clicking there. What about if I click on papers? I've forgotten the title of this thing, so how would I get the whole paper? Well, what about this one? Influence of urban heating on the global temperature land average. Well, it's taken long enough for it to be a whole paper here. They compare the distribution of linear temperature trends for the different sites to the distribution for a rural subset of 15,594 sites chosen to be distant from all MOIDIS identified urban areas. 1/3 of the stations in the US and worldwide have a negative trend, and I guess the other 2/3 show an even greater positive trend, so both distributions show significant warming. I wish they would notice, or I wish they had somebody working with them that could point out that not only is the science correct, whether the science correct, and whether the sentences don't sound deliberately misleading. Because this particular sentence could be interpreted in many different ways. So I can only guess that they have some idea what they're talking about, and anyway, they haven't conveyed the meaning. Anyway, the whole paper is here, and apparently there's been some accusation that whatever their results are flawed. So this paper says urban areas are heavily overrepresented in the citing of temperature stations. Less than 1% of the globe is urban, but 27% of the Global Historical Climatology Network monthly stations are located in cities with a population greater than 50,000. So you've got a really high difference in sampling here, that 27% of the temperature stations are in the 1% of the globe that is urban. This could result in a severe warming bias in global averages using these urban stations. To avoid this bias, the urban heating contribution to global temperature change should be isolated to the greatest extent possible. So they want to evaluate the urban heat island contribution to the Berkeley Earth's surface temperature global land average. Previous analysis of average land temperature have been reported by 3 major teams: NASA, the Goddard Institute, and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. They differ in the methods used to account for the effects of urban heating. The conclusion of the 3 groups is the urban heat island contribution to their global averages is much smaller than the observed global warming. Here, this strikes me as another sentence which has 3 or 4 different possible interpretations, or at least more than one. Does that mean that the urban heat island contribution to global warming is smaller than expected, or the urban heat contribution to the measured values of global warming is smaller than expected? So right here it says they're global averages, but what do they mean? They're global averages of what? Global averages of their measurements, or they're global averages as the are they talking about the population or the sampling? The sample. I'm going to need like a half an hour to parse this sentence. So the contribution of the urban heat island contribution to their global averages. So global average is much smaller than the observed global warming. The observed global warming would be the sample space, so I would think. So they're saying that conclusion of the 3 groups is that the urban heat island contribution to their global average is much smaller than the observed global warming. So they are concluding this way, that the actual global warming is less than the observed. So all 3 of these groups have decided that the actual global average population is less than the observed global average sample, and they are basically trying to figure out how to best account for this phenomenon. So you say they arbitrarily adjust all the data from the rural thermometers to match the trends from the urban ones. I don't think that is accurate at all, because they said in this article the Goddard Institute for Space Science and NASA and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration have all agreed that the urban stations are actually having a greater effect on their measurements. It's just a matter of how to adjust the data is the question, not whether to